welcome to the Calderwood Hall for this, the first of many public question and answers sessions regarding the up-and-coming independence referendum. Before we start off, first of all, apologies, we're running slightly late, and I'll take full responsibility for that. And just before we start, to make you aware of the fire exits just around here at the right-hand side, should obviously the fire alarm go off, hopefully not. Okay, as I say, this event is one of the first of many events that will be organised between now and September by the local Yes East Kilbride campaign. Yes East Kilbride are not the SNP. Yes East Kilbride are a local community group campaigning for a yes vote in the up-and-coming referendum. The idea of these nights is to, let people actually find out the truth about the referendum and find out what's actually going on and coming down and get involved in the debate. Now, I'd like to take the personal opportunity to thank each and every one of you for coming out tonight, giving up your Friday night to try and find out a bit more about what it means to be voting in the up-and-coming referendum. These events are open for all, whether or not you're voting yes, no, or whether you're still undecided. It's important that you come down and be able to ask the questions that are important to you, so that the day that you walk into that booth on the 18th of September, you know that not only are you voting for the right reasons, the well-informed reasons, but something that's the right reason for your own personal values. Okay. So, obviously, before we move on, I would just like to also introduce briefly our guest that we've got tonight. The first guest on there we'll be starting off first is John Davidson, who is the Vice President of East Kilbride Revenue and Customs Branch in the PCS Trade Union. We also have Fances Curran here. Fances Curran is the former MSP for the Scottish Socialist Party. And of course, I'm sure needs very little introduction, of course, is Elaine C. Smith, who not only is a fantastic actress and comedian, but also does a lot of charity work. And again, I don't need to introduce, and I won't make any comments to upset her with the married or anything like that. So, just to kind of cover the format of how it's going to work this evening, to start off, each of our guests will be given the opportunity of a 10 or 15 minutes just to state their case of where they think about independence, and give you a wee bit back more of what's motivated them to consider voting yes. And then at that point we'll be following on for the audience to come across with their questions, where you'll have an opportunity to put questions to each of the panel, which is the most important part of this evening. So, if you've got any questions, whether you're yes already, and you've got something burning you need to know, now is the time to ask it. That was the whole reason for this night. Following that, we will close down the evening with a kind of brief, quick statement, just a final statement on each of the speakers' point of view of why they believe you should possibly vote yes in the up-and-coming referendum. Okay, so without any further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Mr. John Davidson.
Thanks very much, Paul. It's a real honour to be here, and I think it's the first time in my life that I've actually been above Paul McCartney in the running order to anything, so that in itself is quite a privilege. I'm going to speak from a very personal perspective, because I believe that we should all vote yes in September. I'll be voting yes because I think that Scotland deserves better than the rack and ruin that's on offer from Westminster. I was a child of the Thatcher years. I lived through the poll tax, and I watched as our industries were privatised and closed by rich men, and it was almost always men through the south. I grew up in East Kilbride. I spent the first 27 years of my life here. The first few years of my life I spent living on the 12th floor of Shaftesbury Court, which isn't very far from here, with my mum, my auntie and my gran, and with a lift that constantly didn't work, I have to say. At the time, I can remember turning on my television to see images, strange images of things called stockbrokers, people called yuppies, quaffing something called champagne and rifling through things called filofaxes, remember those. But I always thought myself as lucky. I had a family who loved me, I was always happy and always had somebody to play football with. But as I grew up, I started questioning more and more about the difference between the place where my family was living and the pictures of this almost alien environment that was beamed into our living rooms nightly on all massive 4 television channels. And I don't subscribe to this theory, by the way, that kids who grew up in the 80s have no grasp or interest in politics. How could we not, when the gross spectacle of this ever-widening inequality was playing out nightly on our doorsteps and in our living rooms? As I got older, and as I left school, started studying politics at Glasgow University in 1997, the same year the first Labour government of my lifetime came to power. And I still remember, and I'm sad to admit this in public, I have to say, singing along to D-Ream, Things Can Only Get Better, if you remember that. As a young Tony Blair walked down Downing Street, shaking hands and embracing with thousands of ordinary people who were just as excited about getting rid of the hated Tories as they were about the prospect of a government who would fight for their interests. And this is even more embarrassing, I can't believe I'm saying this either, in Freshers' Week, I can remember drinking beer bought by none other than Jim Murphy as the party reached out to new members, seriously, and celebrated the seemingly endless possibilities available. And that's what made the next 13 years so crushingly depressing, as New Labour abandoned the people who put their faith in them by backing illegal military interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, by increasing inequality, by failing to lift anybody out of poverty, and by privatising more jobs and services than Thatcher and Major combined. The Labour Party of Keir Hardie, a party that, I remind you, argued on its inception for home rule for Scotland, isn't coming back to the UK anytime soon. Because that party has long since departed, not just from socialism, but from any pretence of social democracy. The political priorities of Westminster are determined by where the votes are, and the votes are in the south of England, and those votes are currently being gobbled up by the likes of the Tories, the Lib Dems, and even worse, by UKIP. Because UK Labour know that even if they wanted to do something more progressive that reflects the attitudes of the thousands of Labour voters out there, that they can't, because they need to compete on the same agenda, the same right-wing, racist, anti-worker agenda. Jean Freeman, who was an advisor to Jack McConnell, was speaking at a meeting I was at recently, and she summed it up nicely, because she said that when Jack McConnell was the First Minister of Scotland under the last Labour-led Scottish Parliament government, she said that at the time there was a clamour for them to close Dungavel, that grotesque spectacle of a detention centre where folk who've committed no crime are punished for nothing more than fleeing war or persecution in their home countries. And Jean said that the reason they couldn't do that is because it would embarrass the UK wing of the party. And that sums it up to me in a nutshell. Independence, far from being the death of the Labour Party, independence could be the rebirth of the Labour Party, so that when you vote Labour, you get Labour. When I left uni and joined the civil service in 2001, I have to stress, not the bowler-hatted civil service, not the Sir Humphrey civil service. And the wages that we're on in my office, we'd struggle to buy a bowler hat between us. But the civil service that does all the unglamorous stuff, such as process your tax return or administer your social security payments. But I have to say, since I joined, I've seen once proud services reduced to a shadow of their previous selves, with almost 250,000 of the government's own workers sacked, hundreds of offices closed, our pensions raided and our pay drastically cut. This started under Blair, it continued under Brown, and is happening today under the current coalition. And the government want to get rid of another 20,000 jobs in the tax office where I work in just 5 years. That will mean the HMRC will have about a third of the number of staff that it had when it was formed in 2004. And in the last decade, let's just have a look to see what's happened to some of the tax offices in Scotland. Oban, no more. Perth, no more. Rothesay, no more. Dunoon, no more. Galashiels, no more. Dumfries, no more. Inverness, no more. Peterhead, no more Motherwell, no more Dunfermline, no more Kirkcaldy, no more Ayr, no more Elgin, no more Buckie, no more Greenock, no more Hoyk, no more Coatbridge, no more Paisley, no more Grangemouth, no more. This year alone, offices in Irvine, in Greenock, in Wishaw, in Motherwell, in Glenrothes, as well as every single public tax inquiry centre, including the one in East Kilbride, by the way, will close, despite the fact that each of these offices are responsible for bringing in millions of pounds of money to the Exchequer. And unfortunately, this systematic assault on the public sector will continue regardless of which party wins in Westminster in 2015. And that's because the Prime Minister, Eton School Tory toff, David Cameron, okay. Where I'd left off, I think I'd left off with David Cameron, to be honest, appropriately enough, so might as well start up with David Cameron. I think I was about to describe him as an Eton educated Tory toff, which he is, and he's worth £36 million. One thing that he announced last year that you might have missed, it didn't have a great fanfare at the Lord Mayor of the City of London's banquet. No, I didn't get an invite either. He announced that far from being a response to the so-called economic crisis brought about by the banking collapse in 2008, his austerity cuts programme is now business as usual. Because he said, and I'll quote him, I'm not going to do the accents, I'm not very good at accents, "We have a plan and we are carefully implementing that plan. But that doesn't mean making difficult decisions in public spending. It also means something more profound. It means a leaner, more efficient state. We need to do more with less, not just now, but permanently." And the parties who will form the next UK government in some combination, the Conservatives, the Liberals, Labour, or indeed UKIP, are all committed to the same austerity plan by and large. But that plan isn't reducing the deficit, it's increasing it. That's because the real plan isn't to save money. The real plan is to transfer money, like some latter-day Sheriff of Nottingham, from the poor into the rich. It's only in the last decade that I've been convinced that the best solution, in fact, what I now regard as the only realistic solution to the misery of unemployment, to underinvestment and inequality, is independence. Because to improve the way things are, we need the powers to change them. Scotland only has one Tory MP, yet we have a Tory Prime Minister. Scotland believes that public services are best delivered by public sector workers, yet the Royal Mail is privatised. Scotland wants to look after the poorest and the most vulnerable in society, yet we have the hated bedroom tax. Next month the UK goes to the polls in the Euro elections. Nigel Farage, that former merchant banker, and that's not rhyming slang, and his party of racists are predicted to be the biggest party in England. But they won't get anywhere near a sniff of a seat up here. And the rise of UKIP, if that continues, as it's done in the last few years down there, then it's possible, not only possible, but I would venture likely, that the next coalition government at Westminster won't be Clegg and Cameron, it'll be Farage and Boris Johnson. And it won't be the status quo that we're worried about then. It'll be a whopping £4 billion worth of cuts to Scotland's money. We can't afford to go on like this. We can't afford another wasted generation who live a hand-to-mouth existence while the rich lord over us on the proceeds of the wealth that we create. Westminster expects us to believe in all seriousness that if only we find a way to make the rich richer, then eventually some of that wealth will trickle down to us. I go out canvassing 2 or 3 nights a week, where I stay now in the south of Glasgow. I go out in areas such as Kilmarnock, Kennishead and Hill Park, and I can tell you that people there aren't prepared to wait anymore for this wealth to trickle down. People aren't prepared to watch their communities be destroyed and their livelihoods be destroyed. Ordinary people want to do something about it. They want to take action and they want to vote yes. But when you go out in some of the most deprived parts of Scotland, the polls that you see in the newspapers and the BBC, the voice of the British establishment, doesn't make any sense. These polls that say independence isn't going to happen, independence is looking a bit better but it's still not going to happen, they just don't make sense, because the places I go out to, people are voting yes, 41, 5-1, people are desperate for a change. The richest 1,000 people in the UK increased their wealth by £170 billion since the bank's collapse. Now, I don't know about you, but I haven't seen any of that wealth trickling down. And when we win that change in September, we can show that there's a better way of doing things, that values people as people, develops our communities and distributes the vast resources of our country fairly. And by doing so, we'll be setting an example to all nations around the world that prosperity and equality are not mutually exclusive but mutually beneficial, because some of the happiest countries in the world, some of the richest countries in the world, are also the most equitable. That's the kind of country that I want us to be, but we've no chance of that under Westminster. The important thing isn't how much money is in a society, but how that money is distributed. The poorest countries in the world still have millionaires, and the richest still have people sleeping in the street. Winning the yes vote is not the end, by the way. It is the beginning. The future that I want as a trade unionist won't just fall into our laps. When we win the referendum, it'll be the trade unions that negotiate on industrial relations. When we win the referendum, it'll be the public sector workers who negotiate on public services, and it'll be the people who make the policies rather than an isolated elite. I attended the Radical Independence Conference last November in Glasgow with over 1,000 people from around the world. That emphasised to me that this isn't a constitutional question, this is a society question. What do we want? Do we want more of the same, or do we want a chance for economic fairness and social justice? My trade union, PCS, held the most extensive consultation exercise of any trade union on the referendum over the last year. We wrote out to every single member in Scotland with information from the yes and the no camps, and had meetings of members in every branch in the country. We then had a conference in Glasgow at the end of February, where branches voted on whether the union should back yes, no, or remain neutral. Whilst we did agree to remain neutral, crucially, not one single branch voted to support no. Not the tax office branches, not the DWP branches, not even the branches that represent workers in Faz Lane and in Coolport. And we'll now be holding hustings events in every town and city of the country to take the message to our 30,000 members to compare fairly the case of yes versus no. And I'm confident that when we do that, I'm confident when our members see a fair comparison that they will join me in voting yes in September, but also not just to get a yes for an independent Scotland, but as a means to transform Scotland from a low-pay, highly unequal society to one where we can all play a part and receive a fair share in return. I started by saying we deserve better, we do deserve better, and on September the 18th we can take the first step to make that happen. We can change the world this year. Great things start with a yes. Thank you.
Fantastic, thanks very much, John. Moving on to our next speaker. The next speaker is a leading activist of the Scottish Socialist Party. Spent much of her time as an MSP campaigning to try and get free and nutritious meals for all school children across Scotland. During her role as MSP, she also took on the role of spokesperson for enterprise, housing, Europe and education young people. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Fances Curran.
First of all, can I say thanks very much for the invitation as well. The last time I think I did the political campaign in East Kilbride was a good while ago. I was in the Labour Party youth section, and allegedly Aztec Camera were members of the Young Socialists in East Kilbride. We thought we were going to change the world. There was thousands of us. We were campaigning against YTS, and it was actually Yops conscription. My denim jacket was a lighter shade of blue then. And we really believed we were going to change things. Aztec Camera weren't any members for long, by the way. That was just before they get famous. And then a lot better things happened for them. But good morning, Britain. That was the attitude then. Now I find myself decades later, again at a political meeting in East Kilbride, and this time putting the case for an independent socialist Scotland, or in my case socialist, an independent Scotland, and breaking away from Britain. Why is the question? What happened in the intervening years? Then the majority of people in Scotland were working class. Then the majority of people in Scotland voted Labour. 30 years later, the majority of people in Scotland are working class. And still, at least half, but just edging at the majority, still vote Labour. Why has nothing changed, is my question in that time. I've got enormously high hopes. I'm just checking the lady's okay. Just checking. Now that's commitment. I want to stay after that. If the no campaign, that says it all, by the way, about the yes campaign compared to the no campaign, that level of wanting to take part in the debate, to come out to meetings and to see it through to the referendum. But now I've got really high hopes in a different direction. That if we get independence in September, we've got the ability to transform our lives, to make choices that we've never had before. My difficulty with the other side of the debate, and that includes many Labour members in my own family, is that all I hear, is that we're not good enough. We're not good enough. I hear it in the media. I hear it from the head of the European Union. I hear it from David Cameron. I hear it from George Osborne. I hear it from Johan Lamont. I hear it over and over again in the media. You're not good enough. You're not good enough. You're not good enough. I even hear it from friends, from family, from workmates, who put the same arguments when we're having a drink or when we're sitting around for dinner. And my question, and I keep putting it in the debate, is why are we not good enough? What makes us not good enough? And who decided that we're not good enough? Who says? Says who in whose army? To use the colloquial. And I'm fed up with it. I'm absolutely fed up with it. Because for me, I've had my entire life faced the mantra of you're not good enough. Growing up in Easterhouse, 1970s, early 1980s, we had it all the time. You're not good enough. You're not good enough to go to university. You're not good enough to get a decent education. You live in damp housing. You're not good enough. Your postcode's not good enough to get a job. That was what the media was full of. We're too uneducated. We're too poor. We're too violent, too many gangs, and you're not going to go anywhere, you're not good enough. And it's not just me. Young people today are getting that same message. Jobs, mass youth unemployment, you're not good enough. Isn't it time we change the record? We need to pose the question, yeah, we are good enough, and why are we good enough? The question in this debate from the other side is the wrong way round. Don't think we didn't know that people thought that of us living in Easterhouse. Don't think we didn't know that when you went and you said where you came from, the assumption was, oh, she's for there. She's not going to make much of herself. Why is this narrative, this story continuing today? We knew the system was unfair. We knew we were poorer than other people. We knew that there was violence in the scheme. We knew we lived in damp houses. But you know what? We believed we could change it. It wasn't an individual failure. It was a system failure. All my aunties and uncles worked. My dad was a shipyard worker. My uncle was a toolmaker. My other uncle was a brickie. Was it their fault that we never had enough money or we were too poor? They didn't decide the wage rate. They didn't decide the rents. They didn't decide whether they were going to be made unemployed or not. And the attitude in our house, we were a Labour house, and the attitude in our house was get an education, 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 and then you can change it. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, by the way. I would say the same to my son today, get an education, then you can change it. And that's the point. Are you saying that we can't be educated enough, that we don't have a generation of young people, or people my age, a wee bit older, who can actually contribute to making Scotland a much better place? Now, 30 years ago, there was a huge percentage of poverty amongst children in Glasgow. I look at the figures today, it's going to be 1 in 3 again. Well, it is 1 in 3 actually, and it's going up. Why is it not changed? Why is that not changed? Has it changed for my family? For the people I know who live in Glasgow now? No, it's much the same. It's a failure of the Labour governments we've seen, and it's a failure of the Labour Council. And I'm sad to say that, because I was in the Labour Party. My mum was in the Labour Party, my sister was in the Labour Party, and yet we've seen it getting worse. Now everybody says we're going to eradicate child poverty. We don't agree with child poverty. We want to stop children living in poverty. We want to eradicate poverty. We want people to have a decent standard of living. We want everybody to do well. So why is it still here? Trade unions say they want to end it. Tony Blair says he wants to end it. Poverty Alliance, the Child Poverty Action Group, Bernardo's, Children First, Children in Need, Johann Lamont, Gordon Brown, the list goes on. Does anybody agree we should have poverty? So everybody agrees we shouldn't have it. And the question is, why is it still here? Oh, it's about wealth then. We're not good enough. How much wealth do you need? How much do we need to take everybody out of poverty and guarantee a decent income? Have we got enough? Do we need to get more? The answer is we've got plenty, and I'll come back to that. But if we've got enough to take everybody, every single person, every young person, every family, every pensioner, every person who's in receipt of disability benefits, everybody out of poverty, if we've got that wealth, then the big question is, why has it not happened? Everybody agrees. What's the problem? So I'm going to fast forward a wee bit for you, it's the 1970s. Just pretend it's an episode of Doctor Who. And I'm in the mid-1980s, and I find myself at Westminster, working in the House of Commons, working in Parliament. I'm on the National Executive Labour Party. I'm sitting alongside people like Tony Benn and Dennis Skinner. And I come for a scheme, and I've been catapulted Easterhouse into this world. And to say it was a culture shock is the understatement of the decade. It was such an education, huge education. And guess what? You're not good enough. Thatcher was in power. Tories were on their rampage. Everything was getting privatised. The miners are in strike. There's protests outside Parliament. The GLC and Ken Livingstone have got the mass unemployment figures up in neon lights, and I'm glad they did, shine them right in to Westminster. There's protests, the school students are in strike. Everybody's outside protesting. Working class people trying to reclaim their communities against the ravages of Thatcherism. They're privatising everything. Gas, electric, water, aeroplanes, docks, Rolls Royce, British Telecom, the lot. 50 companies in the end. And I'm quite new, and I'm a wee bit, I don't know where I'm going, and I've got my pass, and I'm doing all this, and I work for this guy called Terry Fields, who's a firefighter for Liverpool, who takes a worker's wage. Anyway, that's not a story. But I'm like, all right then, okay. And every night, in the bowels of the House of Commons, there's these wee round things, they look like railway arches, but they're kind of caves, and they're really down below, and you'd hear all this clattering and banging, and people rolling trolleys in, and waiters in the full rig out, you know, the aprons down to there, and the maitre d' stands, and I'm like that, what's happened? What happens in there? Naive, he's just arrived, a bit behind ears. Oh, that's the private dining rooms. Oh, all right then, okay. What happens there? Ah, that's where the MPs get invited, and the lords and ladies as well, because remember they make laws too, they've got power too. They get invited downstairs for the best of champagne, the best of caviar, the oysters, the cellars full of wine, and all the big companies come in and lobby them. That's where the contracts for privatisation were sorted. That's where the big multinationals come in and said, yeah, we'll buy your gas and electricity and water if you're in England. And that's where British Aerospace and the shareholders came in. That's where it all changed hands. And I'm like, oh, right, that's how it works. And you know what? It's not changed. The dining rooms, the private members' clubs, the corporate boardrooms, and the editors, the offices of the big daily newspapers, the tabloids in particular. So what are we going to do to change that? It'd been interesting to see how the bedroom tax went down there. That's where the contracts for ATOS get decided. That's where your job got privatised, or your job, civil service jobs got privatised. That's where G4S got the contracts for the Olympic Games. Now the problem with this is, how do we, as working class people, get access to that? How do you get to lobby? I never get invited to the dining room, I wasn't good enough. Labour MPs, and some of them might get invited, but I never get invited, and neither did Terry Fields. We're not in the room. We don't get to lobby. We don't get to influence in the way that we think our society should go. And we're voters. We vote Labour in this country, and we don't get to have that say. So, fast forward to 2003, this is a quick version I did say, very quick episode of Doctor Who. And it's 2003 and I find myself elected to the Scottish Parliament. I'm back in Scotland. I've been for a good while. And I get myself elected, or I didn't expect to get elected, but I get elected to the Scottish Parliament. And all of a sudden, I find out that I am good enough. I'm like, oh wow. Good enough now? How do I know I'm good enough? Because I get an invite. Now, the Scottish Parliament's not nearly as posh as Westminster, alright, and neither are the dining rooms, but got all these invitations. That's just a wee bit of the postbag that comes in for MPs, MSPs, sorry. The oil and gas industry want to talk to me. The water industry wants to talk to me. The Royal Bank of Scotland wants to talk to me. I wonder what they wanted to talk to me about. And all of a sudden, I'm viewed differently. Now, I've not changed from the 20 years before when I was in Westminster. I've not changed from the 3 weeks before when I had bad hair and I was up at 6 in the morning campaigning. But all of a sudden, I'm getting wined and dined. And the question is why? And it's because I've got the power to amend legislation, move legislation like the Free School Meals Bill, influence policies, do all these things that you can do once you get elected, like the MPs did in the dining rooms. And these people want to talk to me because they want me to put their issues on the agenda. They want me to support their amendments for the deregulation of the banking sector. They want me to be lenient on taxes for the oil and gas industry. And the water industry actually want to lobby me to persuade me we should privatise Scottish Water. They were on to plums, by the way. Let's make it clear. But this is the point. Now I hadn't changed. Are you telling me if Scotland goes independent, we're not good enough to know, with the enormous wealth, the enormous the wealthy economy we have, that a few days after that vote, people wouldn't be sending us wee invitations? All of a sudden, we might become good enough. And I think that's the point. Who makes those decisions and where do they make the decisions? And these people are really keen. Barbara, who was worked with me in Parliament, and has a much more equal relationship than her being my PA. She used to sack me every day for not putting things in the diary. And she was phoned up, this company phoned up, this is how it works. They phoned up and they said she was getting harassed, and I said, who is it? And she said, they want to speak to you, they're not speaking to me. Monkey, you're the organ director. Oh, no way, what is it? She's like that, no, they need to speak to you, they need to say, it's really urgent. Oh, is it really urgent? Hey? She's like that, I'll cause this, that and the other. And I said, no, who is it? And she said, they wouldn't tell her. And I said, no, I'm not speaking to them unless they tell me who it is. Turned out it was all, I was like, that's a lobbying company. I said, go back and phone them up and find out who they're lobbying for. They were lobbying for the financial sector in the banks. In London, that's a London company. And he said, just to speak to them. And I went, no. She said, if you speak to them, they'll give you £60 for a charity of your choice. And this might sound a bit harsh, right? I went, no, okay, they came back. If you speak to them, they'll take you out for dinner at this restaurant. I was like, no. And then it came back the next day. If you speak to them, they'll send you a crate of champagne. I'm like, no. And then I was thinking I might end up getting the Caribbean holiday offered at this rate because they clearly had to speak to me about something. And I'm like, no, I'm not speaking to them. And that's the point. They buy access. Now what we did is we said, we've got a different approach. Open up the Scottish Parliament. When the nursery nurses were in strike and they're all outside with their placards and singing the greatest nursery rhyme songs put to strike action you have ever heard, they weren't allowed in. And the people in my area couldn't get in. You see, the women couldn't get in. I was like, no, signed a whole lot of them in, 300 of them. The guy at the front desk nearly had a heart attack. They're like, no, they're all coming in. Go on. We're MPs, MSPs, come in. And they couldn't get to see it. And I said, there's Wendy Alexander over there. Go talk to her. Just go ask her why you only get 14,000. Do you want 16,000 and she earns 52,000? But I think that's fair enough. I think that conversation should take place. The Calmac workers, they came up outside protesting don't privatise us, signed them all in, said, there's Jack McConnell having his lunch in the canteen. Gave me his due, he wasn't up in the posh restaurant with the waiter service and all that. Go see him, the next minute I turn round and there's Jack McConnell and 3 Calmac workers in their tabars having a wee tete-a-tete over his macaroni cheese. And you know what, it worked, because they never got privatised. I'm not saying that one conversation worked, but access worked. Now, what kind of decision-making do we want in Scotland? Is that the type of decision-making? Are we always going to be outside saying this is the Scotland we want when these multinationals, big companies and the people who wield power are inside? Or do we open it up? And for me, that's what this is about. It's about whether you get that access to decision-making, to power. And you know what? I'm afraid Westminster, is it 78% are millionaires? Better check that fact about something like that. Terry Fields was a firefighter. When I was in Westminster 20 odd years ago, working class people became members of Parliament. Not now. Oh, not now. Career politicians. Made $1 million by the time they've been there for 12 years. The salary and the pension. Do they represent us? When you get elected, you become the richest 3 to 4% on your salary. 3 to 4%, you move into that bracket. They don't represent me. How do I get access to that? Whereas Edinburgh, well, it's only a train ride away from me. And if they don't let me in, I'll find somebody. Or else I'll just need to barge my way in, as some of the nursery nurses did. And for me, it's about those decisions. Are we wealthy enough? Do we have enough money? There's millions of figures out there. I teach economics for my sons these days. My students are demented with me, but I keep giving them all the facts and the figures on the economics debate, and I'm just going to give you one quote. The Scottish economy would rank among the top 50 in the world by size of GDP and would be relatively wealthy, richer than the rest of the UK, and in the top 20 in terms of GDP per head. On the 10th of February, the Financial Times very kindly produced an article and 4 graphs that gives you the facts. Now, we'll still be that wealthy the day after the referendum. It's not going to change. Currency, ginger bottles, wee bobbies, I don't care. We're still going to be that wealthy, and we've got the potential to become even wealthier. The big question is, who gets to decide what to do with it? Is it the people in the dining rooms in Westminster? Or is it those in the Scottish Parliament where we can get access and influence? And in Scotland, working class people can influence, you can get access. Goodness, you can even get elected to the Scottish Parliament, and that's saying something about politics these days. And therefore for me, I think I'm good enough. I think you're good enough. I think your sons, daughters, grandwains, nieces, nephews are good enough. We've got world-class universities. The bits we don't know, we'll create the courses, we'll open the doors, and we'll encourage young people to go into it. I'm good enough, you're good enough, they're good enough, my 14-year-old's good enough. Generation Yes are good enough. Who says we aren't? Finland, Norway, Denmark, they're good enough. Let's believe in ourselves. For 15 hours on that day, the 18th of September, For one time, and one time only, those dining rooms in Westminster do not have the power. We can take it away from them. Depending on how the vote goes that day, power will go back to those dining rooms in Westminster, or it will move to Scotland, and we can open up democracy, a new constitution, open the doors, let the people in, and have a completely different society, and have it as a beacon throughout Europe. That's the future I would like to see, and I hope we can convince those Labour voters in particular to put the cross in the right place.
As I'm sure you are all aware, we had a slight change to our advertised in their original lineup for this evening. As you may know, obviously Jim Sellers was supposed to be here this evening, and unfortunately, a week ago today we learned of the very sad news of the passing of obviously Margot. Fortunately enough, we found that very kindly Elaine C Smith took time out of our schedule to come along and also to fill that gap that's left behind with Jim, and of course that Jim sent us all his best and was very happy we continued on with the night. So again, it means very little introduction for Elaine C Smith. All will say some things that I seen Elaine give a talk myself personally at the big rally last year in Edinburgh, and I took a wee bit more interest in finding out about more how our kind of politics and stuff like that sits. Obviously from Glasgow, still stays in Glasgow. The posh part of Lanarkshire, of course. One of the points I noted about Elaine is she said, obviously coming from the kind of traditional left-wing background, working class background, and the politics were very much that way, and indeed I believe was for a short time a member of the Labour Party. Yep. And she obviously came through the times and noticing a bit of a difference in seeing how things were, the traditional kind of mindset of probably women left out of the picture a bit more. And then she described as getting involved in politics in her present position through anger and frustration of the way things that were going on. And one of the interesting things I heard from that is that her whole view has changed entirely now, in the fact that she now looks at the SNP government and the opportunity of independence as an opportunity to deliver hope, justice and equality to those who need it across Scotland. So, without any further delay, ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for Elaine C Smith.
Thank you, thanks very much. There seems to be a lot of agreement on the platform actually tonight. We all come from a very, very similar sort of bent, if you like. We're all, I think I was a member of the Labour Party for about 6 months and left in disgust during the miners' strike when I saw that actually, there was a quote my husband found a couple of weeks ago that has really, really stuck with me, and everything that has been said, particularly about the Labour Party and everything over the last few months and years, and my own personal discovery seems to be encapsulated, and it was actually a quote from Ralph Miliband, Ed Miliband's father. Ralph Miliband, unlike Ed, was a great socialist, but anyway, in his book he talks about the fact that the Labour Party are there to manage discontent. They're not there to change it, they're there to manage the discontent. They're not there to make huge changes because they're part of the system. They're part of the elites that are running everything. So they actually don't want things to change. So I would only say that I agree in many, many respects with everything that has been said by Frances, John, everybody, about the type of Scotland that we're envisaging. I'm also here, not because I don't want to be here, I was just trying to remember when the last time I was in East Kilbride. I have played the theatre here many, many times over the last 25 years, when in my days with 784 Theatre Company, Wildcat, Borderline, but I reminded myself there of one of the first times I played in East Kilbride. It nearly put an end to my career because it was in the Rolls Royce Club and I was a singer in the band there. I was about 18 at drama school, and it is something that was imprinted in my mind when a drunk woman came up, being held up by two folk. She decided she'd come over and say to me, "See you, Hen, you're the worst effing singer I've ever heard in my life." So I hope I don't get that response tonight. That's all I'm worried about, really. But I was just reminded of it there when I came in. Please calm down, don't throw anything. I've also been, really moved by the way that Jim Sillars has approached the whole situation with Margot as well. He texted me tonight. I've been asked, her memorial service is 2 weeks tonight, but her funeral was actually today for the family. And I texted Jim to just, send love and all that, and to say that I was coming along here tonight. I realised that on that journey, I was with Ruth Wishart today, another big Yes campaigner today, and she gave me an idea. She's been at the I Write Festival, that I would really like to dedicate this meeting tonight to a woman that is actually partly responsible for me even being on this journey at all, and that woman is Margot MacDonald. Jim said an amazing thing in an email the other day about the fact that what he's been blown away by is actually his grandchildren. Because his grandchildren knew that their granny was in the Parliament and all of that sort of stuff, but they had no idea the impact that Margot MacDonald had, particularly in working class, but not only that, in communities across Scotland. And they couldn't believe that their granny was on the front page of the Daily Record or the Evening News and all that. And they've suddenly discovered that their granny's a celebrity. And he said that's been one of the most joyous things about it all, in terrible circumstances. But she is a massive loss. But in actual fact, one of the things I thought, timing is everything in politics. And Margot, I was supposed to see her on last Friday, and I heard that things were going downhill rapidly. And the one thing that made me laugh that day, through a lot of tears, was that Margot had managed to wipe Eddie Izzard off the front pages. Coming up. Because I had been asked, would I go and do a debate with Eddie Izzard and all that sort of stuff, and I said no. I said because it'll just give the likes of the BBC, and they'll do that light-hearted, oh, here's a comedian up against another comedian, and it'll be all that. And so I released a statement where I do love Eddie Izzard. I think he's a brilliant stand-up, always have been to see him several times. But I know that he's thinking about his own political career at the moment. He's actually thinking about running for mayor in London and all that, so he's getting a wee bit of practice up here in Scotland. And he's very entrenched in the Labour Party as well. But what I did say was, if Eddie Izzard was living here, he would be voting yes. Because the Yes campaign encapsulates every single one of the progressive ideas about the type of world we want to live in, and he would be voting with us. And that seemed to me a really important thing, because what we're getting the love bombing at the moment, and we're getting the celebrities coming into it, we're getting the David Bowie coming in, another big hero and all of that. Now, my thing with David Bowie, he's got every right to have his own opinion about what politics. I've never heard him say a thing about the Iraq War. I never heard him say a thing about massive poverty, about the terrible genocides that have gone on throughout the world. I never heard him make a political statement. Why? Why, when just Scotland decides to have a democratic vote about its future, is David Bowie deciding to make a comment on it? I really don't understand who pushed him. And I also thought it encapsulated the real class stuff that is going on at the moment. Where did he decide to announce it? In a community centre in Easterhoods? No, he decided to announce it, a multi-millionaire through another multi-millionaire in Cape Moss, at a ceremony for millionaires to tell Scotland to stay. I don't quite think that was the message, David. I don't think that's the way through. And when people like me come onto platforms They think, oh, well, she's just jumping a bandwagon. I would like to see, I am on no bandwagon, you will know this, Frances, and many other people. I've been a political activist for 30 years. I'm not here because I'm some sort of celebrity. I never wanted to be a celebrity, I just wanted to be an actor and be creative and do the job I do. The fame and all that stuff came as a side effect. I was and am a political campaigner for social justice, from everything from the miners' strike to the women's movement to anti-apartheid, all my life. I was brought up in Lanarkshire, in a mining village here, in a family that cared about what went on round about it. And I was in a Labour family as well, and one of the things I said at the rally in Edinburgh was, you know, I was part of a family that believed in the post-war consensus. We believed in Britain. We believed in a notion of what British values were. My dad was in the Air Force, one of the proudest things. He was in City of Glasgow Squadron. The war was one of the biggest things in his life. Absolutely proud of it. It is us in Scotland here who are attempting to hold on to what those British values were. It is London and the southeast of England, and London, a city I love, I have to say. This is not any racist nonsense about this. This is about where, as Frances says, where power lies. And the power lies in the hands of elites that run things for each other. And they have no notion of how we live here. They have no notion of how people live in the housing estates in the City of London, or in Manchester, or in Sheffield, or anywhere else. But I started on this journey here when I started to see the betrayals, when I started to see the managing of discontent, that there wasn't ever really a notion of change. And the people that set me on that road were Margot MacDonald and Jim Sillars. At a meeting in Pat Kane's house when Pat was a pop star, and Ricky Ross, the Deacon Blue, was there, and he's still a pop star, but he doesn't care about it as much now, and he's all baldy. But anyway, but he's one of the finest singers I've ever heard in my life as well. Anyway, Pat Kane's house in Peel Street in Partick with Joan McAlpine, and they invited myself, my husband, David Tayman, Ricky Ross, and we sat there, and they were talking about artists getting involved because they knew not that celebrities should be bombed in, but the writers, the poets, the actors, the painters, the actors, the people that are out there and they're visible and connect with ordinary people needed to be engaged. And they also saw that the answer to particularly left-wing politics in Scotland was not going to be the Labour Party. And as we were watching more and more Tory administrations get elected, we were also aware that the democratic deficit was there, and that we would not in any way ever get the party or government that we voted for. That's what set me on this journey. I've not just turned up because I think, I think today I'll vote yes. No. This has been 20 odd years. I am on the advisory board of Yes Scotland. I am chair of the Scottish Independence Convention and have been for the last 8 years. And I am out there campaigning with every fibre of my being for a yes vote for this country, because that's where I see change coming. And change is we have a chance here. Now, people are scared. It was actually something that Alex said, and I would also like to say I've never been a member of a political party since, and I've no intention of ever becoming a member of one. But I would like to say here and now, and thank the SNP for campaigning for all these years to bring us to this place. And I think they deserve a round of applause, as well as Margaret MacDonald. There are many people within that party who have fought for this and not lived to see it happen. And I have to say, when the Scottish Parliament happened, I never thought this day would happen either, but there was no real appetite for it. And what I love about the debate in this is simply asking the question, do you think Scotland should be an independent country? You know what that question does? It makes us ask other questions. And Frances and I were talking earlier on about the rage in some people, that tribal rage, particularly in the Labour Party, I'm getting from friends and family as well. And you know what they're raging at? They're raging we've even got to ask the question. And you're like, we're allowed. We're allowed to think, you win or lose. We are allowed to talk about the type of country that we want to live in. We're allowed to imagine the type of place we want to live in, to exchange ideas. I was talking the other day about it. Can you imagine what political discourse and political debate would be like in Scotland now if we weren't having a referendum? What would we be talking about? We would be trying again to manage the neoliberal politics, the economics of Westminster. And my thing is, I've got a lot of friends in the Labour Party, I have a lot of friends who've gone in and dedicated their lives to fighting for social justice. Where we differ is, I do not believe that the corrupt boys' club that is Westminster will deliver for the people who need it the most. It is the inequalities. We live in the fourth most unequal country in the world, in the Western developed world anyway, but that is not good enough. And I've also seen the class divide as well. See the people that have got money in Scotland, they're voting no. And that, I'm lucky, I'm one of the people that's got money and I'm voting yes. And see if my taxes go up, that's fine. That's fine, because I'll know where those taxes are going. And I know, for one thing, that they won't be going to pay for Trident on the Clyde. I know that certain aspects of our life will be determined by us. I remember when the crash happened in Ireland, I was doing panto, I do panto in Aberdeen at His Majesty's every year. A fabulous Irish actress who worked with me. And she was saying that the crash in Ireland, the economic crash, had a terrible time. Of course, they've been following the same economic model as the UK, but that's a whole other thing. But I said to her, do you know, she said, for the first time in my life, I'm seeing people hungry. And she said, that was really shocking for me because I'm of the generation of the Celtic Tiger and everything had been going well and loads of people with money. And I said, do you think if there was a vote in Ireland now to rejoin the UK, that they would vote for it? And she burst out laughing. And she said, oh, Elaine, it might be shite, but it's our shite. Apologies for the bad Irish accent there, but she's quite posh. Anyway, but that was the thing. She says, because we know who did it. We can look in their eyes. We know the politicians and the businessmen that were responsible, and that's one of the great things about living in a smaller country. It's one of, the middle classes, I get a lot given it. Oh, I mean, for goodness sake, it'll all be tartan and haggis and it'll all be, I mean, the television, it'll all be like STV all the time, won't it? You know, that narrow view of what Scotland should be or could be, would end up being. That there would be no progressive ideas, no thinking outside the box, none of that. I can't get over a certain class of Scots who actually cringe at themselves. They cringe, you can read it in the Herald every day, you can read it in the Scotsman. They actually don't like Scots. They actually don't like us, and they certainly don't like working class Scots. And there is a thing about the fact that they managed to, I think a lot of them managed to get out of the working class, and they're like, I'm not going back. Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with being working class. I never ever have. And one of the things that I've always loved about Margot MacDonald was the fact that she's one of the most articulate, intelligent, savvy, political thinkers that was ever around. But she never forgot where she came from. She never forgot who she was representing. There was a great thing, I was at an awards day and Alec Ferguson was being given a big award, and he said it's always nerve-wracking coming back to Scotland, particularly if you've made your career down south, you think you're going to get pelters. And I said to him, I was the MC in the thing, and I said, no Alec, we only give you pelters if you forget your old arse and get a new one. And I said, and you haven't really forgot your old arse. So that's a really important thing. And that point that Frances was making as well about the Parliament being closer. We're always told about how terrible it was in Iceland and all that. You know the thing I like about Iceland, not only have they turned it round, they sent the politicians that were responsible to prison and the bankers. They actually looked at it and made people accountable and turned the situation around. That's what we can do. That's the difference we can make in Scotland. I have loads of opinions, but actually I want to hear what you've got to say. The good news is, from the Yes campaign, is that things are moving. Things are moving particularly, and it's Jim Sillars that said to me as well, this will be one in the housing schemes. And this is something that we in the Yes campaign have always known, that this is a ground campaign. So, you know, flying celebrities in to love bombing us, to tell us that we shouldn't leave, please don't leave, and there'll be a lot more of that. Watch out for the personal attacks that are coming. We've already seen it the day on Alex Salmon and his hotel in New York or wherever he was, Chicago, wherever he was, and expenses and that. You know, nobody ever asks what David Cameron's private plane cost. Nobody ever asks. And I think the First Minister of Scotland, I don't mean he should be spending loads of money, of our money, but he actually shouldn't be in a tent somewhere, you know. He actually should be in an alright hotel because he's representing us. He's representing this country abroad, and what we're supposed to do, turn up with a cloth cap and go, it would be alright if we come in, sir. That's sort of a no good enoughness thing that goes on. But watch out for that in the next phase of the campaign. It's going to get very, very negative. As the polls narrow, we are going to see more personal attacks. We are going to see more of the negative campaigning that has been going on so far. But actually, all our polling shows it's not working. And people out there are not believing that sort of negative stuff. And there is, even Rory Bremner, I read a tweet or something he did the other day, and he said the worst thing you can do to any Scot is come up and say, no, you're no using the pound, or telling them what they can't do. And even those we found that there was a real bump in the polls because folk were just going, I don't know, but I'm definitely a yes now. because of some multi-millionaire Etonian coming up and telling us what to do. I am voting yes, because I believe I want to make this place better. If you think this place is good enough, if you think, I live in the East End of Glasgow now, if you think that 58 years of age as an average lifespan for a working class man is good enough, vote no. If you think everything round about here, if you think it's all right, vote no. One of the big problems, I would urge all of you to try and read Leslie Riddoch's book Blossom, what Scotland needs to blossom. And she doesn't come down on one side or the other. But one of the things that really struck with me was she talked about housing, and particularly housing in an area, East Kilbride, and the overspill from Glasgow. That the loyalty to Labour and the loyalty to that, you've got to remember the abject poverty that people were living in. The slum conditions before the war, before the First World War, right the way through, right into the Second World War and more. That much of the loyalty to Labour is that what was delivered was an inside toilet. I believe we have to hope for more than that. We have to work for more than that now. And somebody said, but we're all brought up, not to get above ourselves, that's Scottish. Who do you think you are? Don't get above yourself. Well, I would like to say to Scotland, let's get above ourselves. It's about time. So that's why I'm voting yes. Thanks.